Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you all so much for coming out for our program this evening. My name is Brianna Walden. I am a recent graduate of Hillsdale College and now work as an external relations assistant at the Charles Koch Institute. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the latest installment of the Charles Koch Institute's Butcher, Brewer, Baker Author Series. Adam Smith said, "It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interest." Through these book events, we seek to highlight the work of individual authors, such as Dr. Burton Folsom tonight, and engage a broad audience in dialogue about the importance of free societies and how they increase well-being for the overwhelming majority of people. I would especially like to thank Hillsdale College and the Alan P. Kirby Jr. Center for Constitutional Studies and Citizenship for co-sponsoring this event. Our program tonight will include time for Q&A and a reception afterwards, so we invite you to all stay and join us for that. As the more than 2,000 alumni of our educational programs at the Charles Koch Institute could tell you, we welcome scholarship, debate, and analysis of crucial public policy issues like those addressed in tonight's featured book, Uncle Sam Can't Count, A History of Failed Government Investments from Beaver Pelts to Green Energy. If you're interested in learning more about how government investments lead to cronyism, I encourage you to check out our website, www.cronychronicles.org. You have a bookmark that has more information about it in your free book that you received tonight. As part of our work to foster productive dialogue among diverse groups on critical topics, we're pleased to welcome Hillsdale College professor Dr. Burton Folsom Jr. as tonight's featured author. Dr. Folsom is the Charles Klein Professor of History and Management at Hillsdale College and Senior Historian at the Foundation for Economic Education. He received his PhD from the University of Pittsburgh and has taught U.S. history at the University of Nebraska, the University of Pittsburgh, Murray State University, and Northwood University. Dr. Folsom has written 9 books, including The Myth of the Robber Barons and New Deal or Raw Deal. His latest 2 works, FDR Goes to War and Uncle Sam Can't Count, were co-authored with his wife, Anita. He is a regular columnist for the Freeman and has written for the Wall Street Journal, American Spectator, Policy Review, and Human Events. This evening's featured book, Uncle Sam Can't Count, is a hard-hitting critique of a government incapable of picking winners or learning from its mistakes. Dr. Burton Folsom and his wife, Anita, argue that the dismal government investment failures demonstrate why business should be left to private entrepreneurs. From the days of George Washington through World War II to the Export-Import Bank today, Dr. Folsom shows how government investments have drained the US Treasury, impeded economic growth, and hurt the very companies they try to support. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Burton Folsom.
Thank you. Thank you, Brianna. Thank you. Yeah, all of those negative things about government investment are true, but we say it with a smile. And we talk about it and teach students that it can be overcome. And my voice, I hope, is projecting and can be overcome. Good. Thank you for coming. Thank you for coming tonight. I'm glad to talk about this book and this important subject. And it really, if you think about this, it connects with American exceptionalism. We talk a lot at Hillsdale College. How many here went to Hillsdale College? Look at that. Good. A lot. We talk a lot about American exceptionalism. And if you think about it, America was founded on an idea. Most nations in the world are founded on some kind of power relationship. Like, you can go back in Europe and trace the battles with the Saxons and the Franks to the difference between Prussia and modern-day France. Those disputes, or some ethnic expansion. America was founded on an idea, the idea of freedom, the idea that we have liberty, liberty works, limited government. And from that, it gets kind of embarrassing to look at the economic history sometimes because we complicate occasionally. And by that I mean we simply got carried away and thought, hey, individual initiative will not accomplish enough with the United States. Let's try subsidies. And we tried to outline this in the book. Uncle Sam Can't Count. We start with a fur. I hated to put this in the subtitle, a history of failed government subsidies from beaver pelts to green energy. We almost said because it's from George Washington to Barack Obama. But it was a shame to mention Washington because I think he was such a great president. But even Washington was caught up in this with the subsidy to the American fur trade. He didn't think private enterprise could stop the British from encroaching from the Northwest Territory in on our early country. So we had to have a government-operated fur company to stop them. And the Indians ended up, who are the prime ingredient in fur trade because they capture a lot of the beaver pelts, virtually laughing at the government company. And it took John Jacob Astor, a private fur trader, to develop in a creative way the system to beat the British. And the system simply was to have agents who live with the Indians and trade with the Indians so that they didn't have to bring their pelts to a fort far away. Do the trade on the spot, extend credit on the spot, and that way you can keep track of what interests your clientele, be interested in consumers. Astor was the one who developed that system privately that challenged the British and kept them out. And so you think, wow. I mean, we thought, well, a private enterprise would never do it. We need the government. We make that compromise and we learn something. Tried subsidies with steamships. Federally subsidized steamship company failed, and Cornelius Vanderbilt succeeded. And it's interesting because John Jacob Astor was the first American to be worth $10 million. And he did it privately, competing against the government company and against the British. The same thing, defeated a government support steamship company and a British company, the same thing. And then we tried it with metal railroads, the Union Pacific, Central Pacific, Northern Pacific, all receiving federal aid. It's interesting, isn't it? Because at Hillsdale College, we study what happens when you when you create incentives in certain directions. In free enterprise, the competition creates an incentive for you to be courteous to your customers and to produce the best quality goods you can at the best price. Interesting, we subsidized the Union Pacific and we said, we'll pay you by the mile. And we were surprised as they went through the state of Nebraska to find, we're paying by the mile now, that the railroad went like this. I gave this talk one time, and I had a person in the audience at Hillsdale. We do elder hostels where people can come in the summer, and we have classes for them, often adults and sometimes retired people. And this retired, he said, I spent my life working for the Union Pacific. I said, wow, really? He said, yes, they're still trying to straighten that line. Yeah, he said. And so, but of course that was the incentive. So naturally when James J. Hill with no federal subsidies came along and built a straight line, he had an immediate advantage. Now, the one good thing that happened with that subsidy, we got back to our roots. The American exceptionalism, the limited government. That government's going to be used for contracts. The government might be used for mail delivery, but for national defense. That's fundamentally Article 1, Section 8. Most of the provisions there are national defense provisions. And so we get to our roots and not having government as an agent for economic development. Because people were beginning to say, gee, after the fur trade and after the steamships and after the railroads, government isn't in the business of picking winners and losers. They just pick losers. And so we went, it was one of the fascinating periods of American history. We went into a phase where America is still a second-rate nation in the 1860s. I mean, the British beat us in railroads. Our textile mills were just copied from what the British produced, and a British person came over and built them. We were way behind the British. And we were behind the Germans in chemicals. I'm going to get into that a little bit tonight. And so all sorts of ways we looked like still a second-rate nation. But the politicians said, we've tried this other way. We've compromised the American exceptionalism strategy. and it didn't work. The railroads were the biggest disaster that we'd had thus far. And they said, we may make it, we may not make it, but we're going to do it with our own entrepreneurs privately. And with that, we go into a period we sometimes call the Gilded Age. Mark Twain gave it that label, from 1865 to 1900. And that is where America emerges as the leading economic power by the end of the Gilded Age. And it's by private enterprise. I'm going to get through two of the industries I want to go through that I cover in the book. And one of them is in chemicals, and I want to talk about Dow Chemical, because Herbert Dow was one of America's great entrepreneurs. And then another one that's fun that I especially want to do because part of the competition was here in Washington, D.C. And that is the airplane industry, the inventing and the development of the airplane with the Wright brothers. And so we have those two that I want to touch on. And as we go through these, I mentioned Herbert Dow in the chemical industry. We went through a period of a generation where we really limited federal subsidies. I mean, we had tariffs sometimes. So I don't want to say there was no effort sometimes by government, but it was very small, much smaller than at other times in our history. And so we have the development of the chemical industry, and Herbert Dow is a tiny chemical producer. I'm going to talk about him in a minute, but I just want to say the Germans, while we were abandoning the idea of subsidies, the Germans decided the chemical industry, and they had the greatest inventive minds in the world at that time in developing chemicals. They did government subsidies, and they did cartels, so that several dozen, it was called the Brom Convention in the bromine industry, and that's one I want to talk about in a minute. The bromine industry had several dozen cartels that were large in size, and they could of the chemical product they were. In the case of the Brom Convention, it was bromine. Bromine, you might think, gee, that doesn't sound that exciting. Well, it's in photography, photographic film, bromine. You've heard that expression, a bromide, puts you a sedative, it puts you to sleep, right? Not like lectures, we don't do that. But a bromide might do that. And so a bromide, or bromine, can be used as a sleeping pill, or industrial purposes for it too. I mentioned one example being the photographic. So there is a purpose for this chemical, and the Germans were producing it at 49 cents a pound. And nobody in the world could really compete with that. And in any case, they had 20 different cartels, more than 20, producing this bromine, and so nobody really dared to get in the business, except for Herbert Dow. Sort of this quintessential American who comes in and says, I think I can do the product better. And Dow comes in, he says, but to do it better with this German competition, I'm going to have to figure out a way to do it cheaper. And so he develops a process which he called electrolysis. He gets patents for all of this. He starts his company. And he's got these patents for electrolysis. And the reason that's good is that it stirs up the water. He came to Midland, Michigan because he thought the water there had exceptional amounts of, it was brine water. It might have more bromine particles. Electrolysis would stir up the water, and it would separate the bromine particles and allow him to capture genuine bromine more easily than the German process. Therefore, Dow was able to produce bromine at 36 cents a pound. Now, Germans, right? 49 cents a pound? Dow, 36 cents a pound. So our economists in the audience say, well, the price advantage goes to Dow, market share will increase to Dow. What he found was that although he was able to sell his bromine in the United States, that the moment he tried to move outside the United States, he had a visitor, Herr Jacobson, head of the Brom Convention. And Herr Jacobson said, because we are generous, we will let you sell in the United States. Isn't that generous? But we're not going to let you sell anywhere outside the country. You can't sell your bromine anywhere. That's our space. And he said, if you try to get out there and sell your bromine anywhere outside the United States, we have a fund, they called it, the Germans, a yellow dog fund. And he said, all these profits that all of our cartels have been producing, we set aside part of the profits in a huge fund just looking for somebody who's competing. And then we find them and we just plunge that money in there and cut the price until they're out of business. And that's what's going to happen to you. Now, that's interesting. Dow responded, he looked at him. He said, you can't tell me what to do. Just kick them. Get out of my office. I like that. A good American spirit. It was interesting, though. After he kicked him out of his office, his staff said, well, he was saying, you can't tell me where I can sell and where I can't. And he kept saying that, but then after about a day, he was saying, I better be careful. You know, this is dangerous stuff. And so what happened was he thought, but I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it. And so Dow gingerly, in the chemical journals, they would have something like a country would say, we would like to buy 200,000 pounds of bromine. And naturally, the Germans would be the only bidder, and that would be the end of it. But Dow began looking through there, and he said, I'm going to bid on some of this. He says, but I don't want the Germans to find out. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bid on it, and I'm going to tell the people I'm bidding not to let them know that it was me. And so then he thought, well, where's the best place I might be able to get away with trading without the Germans finding out? Because people wanted his 36-cent price rather than the Germans' 49. He chose Japan, about as far from Germany as you could get. And then he was selling and making money. And the Japanese said, oh, we won't tell anybody. And so the Germans didn't know. And then he came in and he thought, he got bolder. And he started selling in South America. And then he had a sale in France and England. And, you know, don't tell. Well, what happened was the Germans were not to be fooled forever. And so the Germans figured it out, and Dow got this frantic phone call in 1904 from his agent in New York City. And the agent said, Mr. Dow, the Germans discovered what you did. And he was stuttering, you know, well, get it out. He says, they're selling bromine at 15 cents a pound. And we have no customers. Nobody is buying, they're refusing to buy anything from us. Existing customers are trying to legally drop us. We have nothing. Dow listened, and he said the following. Listen carefully. What I want you to do is go up to the Germans. Don't let them know who you are. Go up to the Germans and buy as much of that 15 cent a pound bromine as you can. He closed down production in Michigan, Midland, Michigan, and bought the German 15-cent bromine, repackaged it with Dow labeling, and began selling it at 27 cents a pound. And he sold it in England, Norway, France, and Germany. He sold some of it right back to the Germans who didn't realize. And they were amazed. He was selling it at 27 cents a pound. And see, now what the Germans had done, they were selling at 15 cents a pound in the United States. But then they were trying to sell at 49% cents around the world. And Dow was undercutting them, and he left the American market to the Germans and simply competed around the world. And the Germans couldn't figure out, and they thought, well, he'll give out after a while. For 4 years, the Germans were undercut while Dow built this war chest of funds. And at the end, now this is wild, at the end of 4 years, the Germans figured out finally what he had done. And they said, aha, the solution. We'll sell it 15, we sold it, we're going to sell it 10.5 cents a pound. They dropped the price further, thus allowing Dow even greater profits. Then they said, okay, we would like to ask you to join us in the cartel. They offered Dow a chance to be in the cartel with him, he wouldn't do it. Instead, he took the earnings from selling bromine and used it to compete with the Germans in their aspirin business. That gave them a headache. They'd been selling aspirin at $8.50 a pound. Dow sold it at 60 cents a pound. Now, I want to give the Germans credit. They invented aspirin, I believe, in 1899. They invented aspirin. But the marketing end, it's interesting. They just couldn't understand, why is he doing what he's doing? To Americans, with American exceptionalism, limited government, competition, entrepreneurship, it's in our blood, in a way. They were totally flustered. And the end result, too, was the Germans invented Novocaine in 1907, right? That we sometimes use for tooth filling. They charged this was in 1907 dollars. They charged $1,600 a pound. If it hurts enough, you'll buy it. If it hurts enough, you'll buy it. Dow got the price down to $30 a pound. The incredible competitive influence of Dow. America joins, not necessarily always dominating. America becomes an international player in the chemical field. And they do it through Herbert Dow. They do it without subsidy to him, while the other side, not learning from the American experience with the fur trade, the steamships, and the railroads, protect their industry, give it protection. It goes out there, falls flat against Dow. Incredible victory. Chemicals is my first example tonight of where we see American exceptionalism and we see the triumph of markets. The second, airplanes. This one's exciting. And it also illustrates how you can't always keep bad ideas down. You know, they just have a way of just bubbling up sometimes, don't they? Now you might think, in light of this, how is it possible that we could have the airplane industry having even a whisper of subsidy? It did. The argument was this in the late 1800s and early 1900s. I know that America has developed well without subsidies in the last generation. I know they're not working when other nations try them. They didn't work when we tried them. But this is a special situation because the airplane has so much dynamic potential. Whoever gets the airplane has enormous power over other nations. The French are subsidizing and publishing research in journals. The Germans are too, and the English are even involved in flight experiments. If one of those countries invents the airplane, they can come over here, drop bombs on us, fly away, and all of a sudden the Atlantic Ocean is no longer a protection for the United States. To avoid this catastrophe, oh, we can wait for free markets, eventually to do it after the Germans have perfected it. And after they've obliterated New York City. Why wait? Why not get the best talent, get it working, subsidize it, and go? That proved to be an irresistible argument. And what we did was we thought, who is the best prepared person to get this subsidy? And from Washington, D.C., the head of the Smithsonian Institution volunteered, Samuel Langley. It's me! How far, am I right? Is the Smithsonian about a mile, or is it 2 miles or so from where we are now? Would that be right to say, a mile or 2 miles? Well, of course, that was a prominent institution, which has been, of science. And Samuel Langley, as head of the Smithsonian Institution, represented one of the great scientists of the United States. He had invented, invented various scientific devices. But furthermore, in the field of flight, he had a lot of experience. He'd written a book called Experiments in Aerodynamics. He had flown a model airplane around the Potomac. And thus, it was a model, it wasn't manned, but I mean, it still was machine propelled. And so he had honorary, he was so respected in the field of science that he had honorary degrees, I should say, from Oxford, Cambridge, Harvard, and Yale. Not Hillsdale, nor the Koch Institute. He had received no help from either of those places. And so what we have is Langley receiving and it was, well, there's the guy. We gave him a subsidy to fund him for 2 flights, to build an airplane and fund 2 flights. And that's what happened in the early 1900s. The United States decided, we've got to get in the game. We funded the guy we thought would be the best guy to do it, Samuel Langley. He was going to invent the airplane. Langley was interesting. He went hard at work. His strictly Ivy League. I mean, he taught for a while at Harvard. His pilot was a graduate of Cornell. And so he was operating there, and trying to build the engine. Langley's theory of flight was interesting. The engine was very important in Langley's flight. And I know you're thinking airplanes, well, did he have a runway here in Washington or something like that? No. He was going to launch his airplane from a houseboat on the Potomac. The theory was this, a catapult theory. He had a big device, almost like a rubber band. I mean, think of this, except it was obviously a lot more powerful. You pull back on the airplane, let go, and it's out there. And so you don't have a runway. You launch it out of the houseboat. Now, the theory, when people would ask him, now how exactly, what's your theory here? He'd say, here it is. He said, ice skating is my parallel. My metaphor, if you will. If you'll notice that somebody who ice skates on thin ice can skate for a while on the ice, skating along, and then after skating along for a while, if he stops, and it's fairly thin ice, you're skating, you stop, boom, you fall in. Flying is somewhat similar. The key is the engine. You get a powerful engine, you shoot it in the air, and you're like your skater. You're floating along, and as long as you don't stop, you're in good shape, but you won't because you have your engine. So the engine keeps you going, and then you gather up the momentum and you're off. Well, the Langley theory was put to the test. We actually, because it's in Washington, D.C., reporters knew, the subsidy was well publicized, we have pictures of the first flight, which I'm going to show you. Oh, here's one, the houseboat. You see the houseboat with the airplane? Whoops. I'll get that later. This is Langley. I regret to say he looks with a beard that's kind of white. Palmer, he doesn't look that much. Tell me no.
Nothing like it.
Thank you. Thank you. But there he is with his pilot. There. And there you see the houseboat. The flight went off. It was launched. The reporters were there. It flew up and collapsed. We have a picture of it. I wanted to show you. Look at that go into the water, tail first. You like that? Yeah. One congressman said after this, the only thing Langley made fly was government money. Yeah. But he had money for a second try. He said, we'll work out the kinks here. We're just a few problems, and we're going to work out these problems. And I think I have a quote here from Langley. Yes, he said, I am in no way affected by this accident, which is part of a large chapter of accidents that beset initial stages of experiments, such as this one. No problem. The Washington Post covered this flight and had a bit of a different opinion. 13 words were what they used to express what they saw. Here are the 13 words. Any stout boy of 15 could have skimmed an oyster shell much farther. Yeah, it was a bit of a disaster, but the second try was coming. The second try came in December of 1903, and it was a cold December day, but the flight went back, the airplane. The launching device pulled it back. It shot up and collapsed again. Every observer said, we looked at this carefully. There was no flight. Any momentum by the plane in both cases was surely from the force of the catapult. There was zero flight that took place. Well, the newspapers were not, well, let me see. You make up your own mind. The Boston Herald said this. Professor Langley needs to abandon flying machines and try his hand at submarines. The New York Times said this. It's impossible. No one is going to be able to fly for about 1 million years. Hard as it is for us to believe, the New York Times was off in its estimate. By 999,999 years and 356 days. 9 days after Langley's second flight, the Wright brothers, two bicycle mechanics from Dayton, Ohio, neither of which had ever been to college, with about $1,500 of their own money, launched the first successful flight at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, with a plane that stayed aloft for 59 seconds. The Wright brothers watched Langley as he went through his process, and they said, we don't think that's right. Langley was considered the great expert, but they said, we don't think that the theory of the catapult with the big engine is the right way to go about it. In fact, the Wright brothers didn't get the engine was about the last thing the Wright brothers got for their plane. They said they watched birds, and they were watching the curvature of the wings, and they tried to build wings with the right curvature and the right turning. They practiced with gliders. They practiced for three winters, about 3 month period. They took time off from their bicycle shop, and they practiced gliding because Kitty Hawk had good wind patterns and some hills. How many have been there? Some been there? Good. Am I right on that wind? Pardon?
They wanted three things: soft hills to land on, privacy, and good enough.
Yes. I like that too, soft hills to land on, because some of them don't work very well. Right. And so they practiced with that, and they finally, when they got and they developed a contraption that they could operate, because they had to have a rudder, they had to have ways to turn their wings in and do things with their wings to regulate their turns. And Orville and Wilbur got so they could do some of that with their feet, and they had foot controls and hand controls. And then they put the engine on the plane. And at that point, they flew in 1903. It was absolutely fabulous. It was sensational. Some people didn't believe it, but the Wright brothers developed an airport outside their city of Dayton. It was called Huffman Prairie, and they would fly around. They got so they could fly for 5 minutes. And they kept increasing their time, 10 minutes, 15 minutes that they could stay. And they would start circling the field so everybody could see them for miles around. They would be circling around in the air. They said, we want to sell our airplane. They realized the commercial benefits, but they thought first the military would be where they ought to go. And so they thought, we'll sell our plane to the US Army. As you know, many of you know, the Air Force was connected with the Army for a while. And they said, we'll sell it to the Army. And the Army can, but we need to have it so it can stay aloft more than 5 minutes. I think you understand that is not, there aren't too many foreign foes where, well, we're going to bring our airplanes over to Germany and park them 3 minutes outside of Berlin and then get up and fly over the city, and that'll take care of them. They knew they had to stay aloft for a long time. And so the point is, they wanted to be able to say, we can do it for about an hour, we can stay aloft. They felt that that would demonstrate that they had something worth developing, and they wanted to sell it for $25,000. So they were offering their airplane to the US government for $25,000. Well, this is interesting. The US government is now, they paid all that for Langley, and now they're getting offered somebody who didn't ask for a subsidy. The government said no, that we're not convinced that you have really conquered the air sufficiently. The Wright brothers went back to the drawing board and said, we'll just keep flying longer and longer, and we may have to exploit commercial opportunities. They even said foreign governments are interested in buying, and if we may have to go that route. I mean, we'll consider it. Also, what was happening, Langley and his supporters were back asking for an additional subsidy for Langley. I think it's important we sometimes weigh in and give cities their proper due. San Francisco, the San Francisco Chronicle came up with this comment. The destruction of Langley's machine should put an end to congressional appropriations of any kind in every field of experiment which properly belongs to private enterprise. Wow. I mean, Hillsdale or the Koch Institute could put that up, and that would be consistent with what we believe, and that's what the San Francisco Chronicle said. In other words, they were against giving anything to Langley. The French entered the picture. So you had the Wright brothers offering their plane to the government for $25,000. You had Langley saying, for $25,000 I can do it again. And the defense of Langley was kind of interesting. Many of his defenders made some interesting points. They said, for example, listen to this. One of his supporters said this: to do otherwise than fund Langley To do otherwise would be to confess that the Board of Ordnance in the War Department did not know what it was about in providing funds in the first place. Ooh, that's a clever one, isn't it? In other words, you're kind of obligated to follow up with Langley. Yeah. Langley said that his machine, he didn't want, unlike the Wright brothers, he did not want filthy lucre. No, this was not to be done commercially for a profit. It was his gift to the nation. The French came in and offered, they said, look, you guys doing the airplane, here's another angle to consider. We will sell you a state-of-the-art balloon. One of these hydrogen, then it was not helium, balloons that would be up in the air and they can't see it, they can't get you. And then you can float around and if you want, you can drop stuff on people. A balloon. So we're interested. The government now, what I'm saying is, was faced with three choices. They could either go with the Wright brothers and buy the Wright, what was called the Wright Flyer number 3. That was the one that was offered to them, the Wright Flyer 3. Langley to subsidize for another effort, or a balloon. And the government was determined to make a decision. This is a perceptive audience, and I have a question for you. Which decision did our government make? Langley, the Wright Flyer, or the balloon? Well, let's take a vote. How many of you think the U.S. government went with Langley? You people ought to be ashamed of yourselves. Put those hands up again so I can count them. Oh gosh, this is huge. How many think they went with the balloon? Several. Wright Flyer. Oh, tell me no. No one in the room. Not one person in the room thinks they bought the Wright Flyer. In this case, a majority of you think Langley by about 2 to 1. And in this case, the majority is wrong. They bought the balloon. From the moment they bought that balloon, there were problems. One of the problems was that somebody reminded them that we tried a balloon on the Spanish in the Spanish-American War, and they shot holes through it. And the thing dropped ignominiously to the ground in the Battle of Santiago. What's also interesting is the French sold us the balloon and invited the Wright brothers over to buy their product if it could be demonstrated to fly. Oh, those clever French. So they sell us the balloon, we buy it, and then they come over and want the Wright brothers to do a test fly. And it was a marvelous test flight. The French were funny. A lot of them didn't believe it could be done, and they called the Wright bluffeurs. Bluffers. Those bluffeurs. Well, Wilbur Wright came over to show the French, and they had to transport the airplane and reconstruct it once they got over there. And he showed, as he did circle 8s all over Paris and into the countryside, they said, the headline was funny, it went, "No bluffeur." And they immediately offered to buy it. That was Wright. Orville Wright did a test demonstration for the government. And they saw him do virtually the same thing. And I'm happy to report we made him an offer. The French are going to buy, but the U.S. government is going to buy some Wright Flyers. And we are going to be out of trouble. But it takes 5 years. In 1908, we finally have that verdict. Now, yeah, I look at this. Those are my, the two chief. We've got the Wright brothers, we've got Dow. And what you see here is fascinating. The efforts by the cartels to subsidize in some way or help protect their chemical industry ended up disastrous. Our private industry with Dow, and Dow, by the way, was smaller than every one of the cartels he was competing against, least of all of them put together. Defeated them so thoroughly they ended up inviting him into their cartel. Of course, he turned them down and ended up beating them in aspirin and Novocaine. Then we succumb to that same illusion that the government support will be helpful when we go to the airplane, because the argument appears irresistible. It's absolutely essential. It's an emergency. National defense. When you think of it, though, the private enterprise with the Wright brothers, how would the government ever pick the Wright brothers in the midst of this? I mean, they couldn't even pick them after they'd done it. How are they going to pick them before they do it? You look at Langley and his credentials, it's an irresistible choice. It's almost impossible to know who is really has the best idea until in a private system you have entrepreneurs try different techniques, turn them loose, and see which one works the best and let the capital flow in that direction. We got off track a little bit with the Wright brothers, but it was not permanently damaging. We got off track in some of our other early instances as well. In my concluding note, and I want to open it to questions, I just want to say, one of the reasons I told these accounts, and we have some modern ones too, because I get into the inventor of fracking and versus price controls and oil industry, more of a modern story. But in those historical examples, what I found, and I have a PhD in American economic history, none of my professors ever taught any of these to me. Now, I don't think they were saying, now, we've got Folsom's around. Don't talk about the Wright brothers. Don't talk about Dow. Folsom's here. He'll tell people. He'll write about it. I don't think they were doing that. They didn't know. I just don't think the people who were my teachers willfully misled me. Sometimes they misled me, but it was not willful. They didn't know because these episodes occur in history. And I tried to read those quotations like the San Francisco Chronicle, the New York Times, the Boston Herald, to let you know this was not an invisible episode at the time. This was front page stuff in 1903. But somewhere it never made it. I'm using the airplane here. But you could use the others, the railroad or the steamship. It never made it into the history books. If we're not going to know the basic information, I'm talking about formulating public policy here. When we make a decision, is this something, and maybe there are things that we should subsidize, but the point is, wouldn't it be better to have that discussion follow a description of the historical record of such subsidies that become a part of our culture, rather than a discussion that occurs in isolation as though these examples never happened. From fur trade, steamships, railroads, airplanes, chemicals, we see tremendous examples of how the market encourages competition, it encourages creativity. The incentives are different. When it's your money on the line, your incentive to spend it wisely increases dramatically. We see all of those forces come together with the invention and the creation of some of the greatest products of the industrial age. I think it's exciting, and I think the more we teach what happened in history, the better decisions we'll make for public policy, and the better education we'll have about the way our country works and the historical basis for formulating arguments about public policy. Thank you. Good. Since I'm speaking in D.C., I guess Langley's descendants aren't in the audience. I'm glad that Thank you. No, I'd be glad to take questions. Do we have anybody? Yes. And we have some people with microphones who will go to various people. Yeah. We're sorry, you have to pay a subsidy to ask a question. No, go ahead.
So I have a question that's kind of two sides of one coin.
Okay.
So America has obviously become a very great country, regardless of all these subsidies. I wondered if you wanted to comment about that. And then do you think that some of these subsidies encouraged private people to compete? Just
Good
to show
question.
the government they were doing it poorly? So, thank you.
Now that's interesting. In other words, does the subsidy encourage somebody to compete? It's sometimes a little hard to get at that, but I think that's a good question because I think there are times where Vanderbilt actually was encouraged to compete in the steamships because of subsidies. I don't think that's the case with some of the others like Astor and the Great Northern. In James C. Hill. In a way it was because they saw how poorly it was done, and that did maybe have a little bit of impetus. But there's a scary aspect of this too, if you're thinking of this from the standpoint of an entrepreneur. And that is, if the government is funding, where does the funding stop? Am I going to perpetually have to compete with people who have millions of dollars? To put this in perspective, to look at the railroad, because that was the biggest one. We had a national debt of $60 million, or 60 to 65 in 1860. That's how I remember it, right? 60 million in 1860. It was a little bit over, but it's roughly that. We spent $60 million plus land on railroad subsidies in the 1860s and early 70s. In other words, we virtually doubled the national debt on railroad subsidies. If you're trying to develop an alternate, the idea of a private route, that's hard to say, well, I can beat this government company. They only have what was the entire national debt for the first 80 years of our history going on. Right? So in other words, there's a scary element, but I do think that watching something fail intrigued people who are imbued with the spirit of American exceptionalism. And I'm so glad they got in and did what they did. If they hadn't, there would be people up here giving lectures saying it never could have been done any other way. They did. And it was in America that it happened. Yes?
I would think a lot of your examples are great, and I think they're fascinating, but one thing struck me really quickly when you talked about the rationale that the subsidy was given for the airplane design. I mean, it did strike me as a compelling argument. The one devil's advocate example I came up with is the Manhattan Project.
Yeah.
What would be your response to that?
I thought that was Anita, my co-author, my wife, and I thought that was such a good argument. And she's a World War II buff. So when it came to the Manhattan Project, she wrote that section. And you know what? We thought, we have to sit there and pull back because the Manhattan Project worked. We funded a project that produced an atomic bomb that was very important. And you have to sit back there and say, okay, that happened. And what I think is good to say, okay, we're not going to come out and say, in every single instance, it'll never happen to the contrary. That's one example, and I want to say something about it, but before I do that, we cover one more directly in the book, the Erie Canal. That was not a federal subsidy, but it was a state subsidy, it's the same concept. What we found with the Erie Canal that was interesting, it succeeded, it was profitable. Every other canal built at state expense failed, including 8 other canals built in New York that were branch canals off the Erie Canal that ended up making New York lose money in the long run because of that. The politics were such, to get the votes for the Erie Canal, they had to agree to get the legislators, all the votes, to branch canals in all those other areas, and they were all losers. When we looked at this better, we saw the topography of New York. The Hudson River moving west is relatively flat, and you're connecting pretty good river systems. If you have a system that's 360 miles or so from New York to Buffalo, plus then you hit the Great Lakes and you can reach Cleveland and Detroit. The topography and the potential were so great that almost anybody could, if the federal government would have done it. If they would have put Langley in charge, he could have done it maybe. Because you're connecting. So, but the point is, when they did it in other places, it failed. And I think the Manhattan Project is a little bit like this in this sense. It is an example, but it sort of stands out. There aren't very many. What that argument, and I wish Anita were here because she's the one who, we talked over this and she says, Bert, here's what I think it is. And the argument says, I think the Manhattan Project worked well because, number one, it had a talented person, Leslie Groves, over it. She said this guy was they actually managed to get a talented person, which couldn't happen. I mean, we thought we were doing it with Langley, but apparently with Groves, we actually did it. The second thing is it was very secretive. If it hadn't been secretive, the subsidies, we'd have had everybody clamoring for a piece of the action. It was very secretive. And they did manage to have the people in charge get the best scientists involved. Normally, when you have something like this in the Erie Canal or other examples, it becomes loaded with political people who are put on the subsidized enterprise. I mean, the case of the railroad subsidies, you would have people who had political connections with the party in power being given positions on the railroad. But see, none of that happened with the Manhattan Project. The scientists were left to determine who knows the best here, and you had a merit system appointing the people who got to work on the project. The end result was a successful project. I'm not sure that could be replicated very often. You get a talented person, you're appointing everybody to work on it on merit, not a political appointment, even though most subsidies have to go through a political process. With the Export-Import Bank immediately, right? Boeing gets most of the subsidies, and then you have a situation where people who work for Boeing end up contributing to the Democratic Party, and sometimes they contribute to the Republican Party. I don't want to make this a partisan thing. They'll sometimes do it both, but it gets politicized is all the point I'm trying to make, is the process gets politicized. And it never worked that way with the Manhattan Project. Not very often does a project meet those criteria. Good talented leader, merit appointment. It's not going to be rated because hardly anybody knows about it. In fact, Truman didn't even know about it when he was president. And Stalin did. During Truman's first day he was president, he did not, Roosevelt never. And Stalin, because he had spies who told him all about it, knew intimate information about it. So we have that wild situation during Truman's first day as president. He did not know about the Manhattan Project, and Stalin did. But then he found out about it, and of course it worked. We may be able to find other examples like this. Some people think the space program might have some, and I think it's fair. But I think you'll find that those examples all fit criteria that are usually going to be missing. And like, for example, the healthcare system, you know, you don't really see that kind of thing popping up with the medical care. I'm just using that as an example. So I think most of the time that will be absent. Good question. Somebody else have one.
Dr. Folsom, I think we have time for one more
Okay.
question.
And I'll be glad to talk with you afterwards. This gentleman's had his hand up so much wanting to ask me a question. And he's here close by, so if he wants to really let me have it, he's...
Okay. Tell us about development of fracking.
Fracking. George Mitchell, not the politician George Mitchell, but another George Mitchell from Texas invented, or I should say popularized fracking. He didn't so much invent it, he popularized it. And it's interesting, just in a nutshell, that it happened in the 1980s. We had price controls on oil, as some of you may remember from the Carter administration and those price controls. Reagan got in, immediately lifted the price controls. So he said, whatever, because the price controls ultimately kept production down, it forced us to import oil, and we had more imports. But Reagan said no, and he cut the price controls. That's just a description of what happened. And so, after he cut the price controls, then immediately George Mitchell said, if I can keep what I'm investing in this, I want to take a chance and try to, because there's oil down there, we just can't reach it. But if I can plow that sand and water and pound away at that, He experimented for 15 years. And yes, how much? $400 million. That's interesting. I didn't have the figure. $400 million. It was an incredible amount of money. The belief he had in Texas there that he could get at oil via fracking. And then all of a sudden it comes forth, and now, back in the 70s we were saying, well, we only have about 8 years worth of oil left, and then it's exhausted. So we need to experiment with ethanol and subsidize ethanol. And we go down that sad road. All the time, the markets were ready to give us much cheaper oil. And now it took 15 years for Mitchell to get his breakthroughs. The horizontal drilling and the fracking. A very exciting story, and I hope that one doesn't get lost. See, that's another example. It's happening now. Let's not let the storyline get lost. Okay? Thank you.